in the previous lesson, we encountered a problem when trying to return two top-level JSX elements from within our curly braces right here. And as I mentioned, this will also apply if we have a render method that tries to return two top-level elements, or a React function component that tries to return two top-level elements. And it's not limited to two, by the way, right? If we have three top-level elements or four, it doesn't matter however many we have, as long as it is more than one, React will raise a concern. And I just quickly want to go into why this happens, and it's due fundamentally to the nature of JSX. Remember, under the hood, behind the scenes, JSX is transpiled to calls to the createElement function, which we explored a couple sections ago. So as we know, if we have something like an h1 with a text of hello, behind the scenes, that becomes React createElement, where we're going to invoke that function, and then the transpiler says, okay, pass in the top level HTML element of an h1, and then provide the children as the third argument. So it's going to look something like this when this JSX becomes JavaScript. And remember, everything starts off with a top-level parent element created by createElement. Every child, whenever this is transpiled, simply becomes an argument, the third argument to an original createElement call, right? So for example, if we had content in here, it would be another React createElement call with its own separate HTML element, right? So maybe if this was, for example, a div right here, and our closing div was right here, then this would be a div, and our third argument would be a call to createElement with an argument of h1. And that relationship continues all the way down for however many HTML elements that we want to represent. Each one is just a child of another parent, going all the way back up to one single top-level parent. The problem is if we try to do something like this as a return value from a component, for example, if we have an h1 and another top-level thing like an h2 with a text goodbye, the transpiler doesn't know how to reduce this or translate this down to one single createElement call that kicks everything off, right? There's no single way to do it because now we have effectively two calls at the very top to createElement, one for each of those top-level elements, the h1 and the h2. And everything needs to begin at a single top point, almost like the top of the pyramid or the top of the tree hierarchy from which everything else flows down, right? We start with one grandparent, and then that parent has children, and then those children have children, and so on. In this scenario, we can't reduce this just to one parent. It has to be at least multiple calls, and thus there's kind of 2 points of entry, right? And this logic is something that we can find even in traditional HTML, right? In traditional HTML, we start with a top-level HTML tag, right? And then we go into head and body. And even in this structure, we have the same idea that we have one topmost level parent element from which everything else kind of descends, right? Everything here is a child of that single one top thing. And so an approach like this is just incompatible with React because it cannot transpile it or convert it to the correct JavaScript that it needs in order to get React to run, which is having just one top-level element. So we encountered this issue in the previous lesson, not for our components return method, but specifically for this little expression here, but the same rules applied. And we saw that we could solve this problem by simply wrapping our two adjacent elements with something like a higher level parent, like a div. And this is, you could say, a suitable approach. It solves the problem. It's technically valid, but it's not ideal. So let me show you what happens if I open up my Elements Inspector in the browser and I click into this confirm password thing. You can see right here that that div persists in our browser's DOM, right? So we've now added this additional element to the page, this div, that doesn't really add anything, right? It's not structurally important. It doesn't communicate something to the user. It's not used for organization. It's basically a hack that we added strictly for React's sake, strictly for our code, right? That doesn't actually semantically mean anything significant on the page, right? It's like dead code that doesn't serve any purpose. You can see for the remainder of the form, we have the regular label input structure for our other two fields, right? And then we have this random div that is housing its own label and input, right? It doesn't serve any purpose. So because this is a common problem in React, the React team introduced a specific solution for this issue, and it is called React.Fragments. You can basically think of a fragment as a component that doesn't render anything to the screen. And its whole purpose for existing is to enable logic like this. React.Fragment is going to be the topmost level parent component under which you can nest as many adjacent sibling elements as you want. So you could think of it as being equivalent to this div right here, right? Its only purpose is to house or nest adjacent children, right? However, the big difference is the React.Fragment component will not render anything to the screen, so it doesn't create any additional DOM markup. So we already have React imported into the file right here, and we can access the fragment component directly from the very top, and its syntax is going to be the exact same as rendering any component in React, right? So we have React available right here. And on the library, on that exported object, we can put a dot to access that object. And then we have a component starting with fragment. So it's going to be React.Fragment. And make sure you provide the closing tag for that component right here. Save that. And now you'll notice we save, the page refreshes, nothing is broken. But now if I click into my confirm password field, you'll notice that we have nothing surrounding the label and the input. Right? So the React fragment, in other words, has not become any kind of visual thing in the browser. It has not become any DOM element, right? It exists purely for React's sake, but it doesn't negatively affect our HTML structure. All we have here is the actual children content within that fragment component, the label and the input, and that's the only thing we're rendering. So now this exists purely for the sake of us as developers and for the React transpiler, right? But it doesn't actually negatively affect the browser experience and things like HTML semantic structure and accessibility as well. That is the sole purpose of React fragments, to solve this problem whenever you have two or more top-level kind of adjacent elements that want to live alongside each other, but you cannot return anything more than one of those top-level elements. That's exactly what React Fragment exists for. And the only other thing I want to show you in this lesson is there is an alternative syntax that you might see for React Fragments, and that is simply removing React Fragment entirely and rendering it like this. You're going to have the less than sign and the greater sign, almost like you're opening up a bunch of component brackets, but not actually writing any component name. And then you're similarly going to close it off right here with the less than sign, the opening bracket, then a slash, and then the closing sign. So this syntax option and the one we saw a couple seconds ago are completely identical. They're both a React fragment. This is just a little bit of a lighter and looser way to write it. So you can see nothing changes in our browser when the page automatically refreshes. And if I click into here, you can see we have a regular label and input. Personally, my preference is to actually write out React.Fragment because if somebody sees that code and they're not sure what it is, it's a lot easier to Google React.Fragment than it is to Google React with, less than sign, greater than sign. However, I do know that some developers prefer this approach just because it requires less code. So it really depends on who you talk to and what their preferences are. But technically speaking, they accomplish the exact same thing. They provide this parent enclosure, if you will, almost like this fake element that doesn't actually appear, whose sole purpose for existing is to house or nest multiple top-level sibling elements that you want to return from either something like a expression like we have here, or even as a top-level component render return value, right? It doesn't matter whether you are in a class component or a function component, you can use a fragment. So you can absolutely have a component, for example, that does React fragment. Sorry about that. My autocomplete is not being helpful, but you could totally have a component that does React fragment and then has an H1 and an H2. This is totally valid as long as you wrap the two elements with their own React fragment. All right, so this can be your top level component render return value by all means if you want something like this. All right, so that is the entire purpose of React fragments. That's all there is to cover in this lesson. So I will see you in the next one.